Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Today's guest is Jason Kander. Jason Kander is the host of Majority 54, a podcast that helps Americans who voted for progress convince those who didn't to join our majority. Each week, Jason and his co-host, Ravi, equip their audience with the tools needed to talk to their conservative friends and acquaintances, counter misinformation online, and still maintain relationships with those whose opinions differ from their own. You can find Majority 54 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics. I am on today with Jason Kander. It could take a while to go through everything that Jason has done, but he is an Army veteran, was the Secretary of State in Missouri, ran for Senate from Missouri, is the president of the Veterans Community Project, wrote a book, is one of the hosts of Majority 54, and probably most importantly is a dad of two. So hi, Jason.
Howdy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have so many things I want to talk to you about. But first, happy birthday. It was your birthday about a week ago.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I am older than you, so welcome to 40.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate it. It's pretty good so far. I have no complaints as of yet.
Yeah, I'm only 42, so I'm not that far ahead of you, but 40s have been pretty good so far, I think. You host Majority 54, and of course, we're a statewide elected official in Missouri. And so you think a lot about talking to people who, aren't necessarily, don't think of themselves as progressive, don't think of themselves as Democrats, getting them on board with ideas that Democrats might have. I am feeling particularly down today after the GOP voted to kick Liz Cheney out of leadership. I have nothing in common with Liz Cheney, don't agree with her on pretty much any political issue that we could think of, but it's really depressing to me to think that Liz Cheney is too radical, too rational, I don't know, something for the Republican Party. So let's talk a little bit about just, where do we go from here? How do we come together? How do we talk to people we don't agree with in this country? It feels like we're headed toward this split, and I don't want to think that way. I want to think about coming together and being one country. So talk to me some about that, how you think about that, and maybe some hopeful words.
Sure. So, it's funny. That's why I started Majority 54 in the first place. It was it was 2017, and I was all over the country on the campaign trail. And being a guy who had won a statewide race in Missouri, the question that I was getting more than anything, there were two. The first one was, how do we win in places where there's, not enough Democrats to automatically win? You got to persuade people. But then what I was hearing just as often that intrigued me was, how do I maintain a relationship with the people in my life, like my aunt or my best friend from high school or my cousin or whatever, who are, voting for Trump or who completely disagree with me, who I care about and I want to persuade, but I don't want to alienate. And that's how Majority 54 was born. The whole idea of the show it's called Majority 54 because initially 54% of the country in 2016 voted for somebody not named Donald Trump. So at first it's a recognition of the fact that we are the majority in the country and continue to be, but it's about expanding that majority and talking to people who are not currently a part of it and doing it without losing those relationships. So look, I just try and remind people that, history is long, and that while we can get really wrapped up in stuff like whether or not, the Republican caucus ousted Liz Cheney, it doesn't actually affect anybody's life. And what we've got to focus on is the fact that, right now, President Biden is working toward passing yet another stimulus. And the one the CARES Act and then the American Rescue Plan have both made enormous differences in people's lives. So I try to focus on what's actually happening because that's what people who don't have political podcasts and who frankly don't listen to political podcasts, because that's the majority of Americans, that's what they care about. Is stuff getting done? And right now stuff is getting done, and that's the very best argument I've always said progress is the best argument for progressive values. And so you got to have progress that people can see, and right now we're achieving that.
So one of the things that we're achieving, of course, is getting a lot of the country vaccinated against COVID, getting the COVID numbers to start going down. But there's this real reluctance on the part of some people to get the vaccine, or not just reluctance, but outright hostility, perhaps, toward the vaccine. Do you have ways that we can talk to people in our lives about the vaccine, things that we can focus on to really get people to want to go along with us?
So there's two things here. The first is something that we can do, and the second is something that's just going to happen, just to reassure people, something that's just inevitable. So first, just like with anything else, it's so important to personalize it. When you're talking with somebody in your life who's hesitant about the vaccine, you can say the same stuff to them that the CDC is saying. You can say the same stuff to them that they could hear on the news, but they're already getting that somewhere else. They're getting that, and they're saying, that's not enough for me. So what you got to do is you got to personalize it, because you got to say, look, you care about me. You think I have credibility by virtue of being a relationship in your life. Maybe this is, a fellow parent in your kid's class, or another congregant in your place of worship, or your neighbor, whatever it is. You have some pre-existing relationship with them. And this is true whether you're talking about persuading somebody to get the vaccine or persuading them to vote for a progressive candidate. It is leveraging your pre-existing relationship and then personalizing it and saying, look, I'll tell you why I wasn't concerned about getting the vaccine. And just really walk them through your thought process, walk them through your experience, right? And then I would say, now let me tell you why I care about you getting the vaccine. And I would start with, I care about you, but I would go further and without shaming them. And that's very important, because once you start shaming somebody, they're going to go right into the defensive posture, and what you're really doing is they're getting more entrenched in their view. So you have to, even if it's hard to do, you have to speak to them with a lot of respect for their view and for their perspective. And, sometimes I think what also helps on this first point is to be very genuinely curious, because somebody who's, hesitant about getting the vaccine, they've gotten to that place somehow, right? There's something that's gone on either in their life or something they've heard, that there's a cumulative buildup to have them make that decision. And if you are genuinely, not like that's weird curious, but like, I'd like to know more about that, then that's going to give you even more credibility when you make your point about why you got the vaccine, because you showed genuine interest in what their thinking was. So that's the first approach. That's a person-to-person approach. Second, and on my podcast, Majority 54, Ravi Gupta, my co-host, made this point a few weeks ago, and I think it's a good one. There is a certain inevitable time element of this, that as things open back up, there are going to be venues and places where it is going to be required for you to have the vaccine, and people are going to want access to that, or B, very socially awkward not to have had it. I was in a meeting the other day where somebody made a comment about how, people who don't have the vaccine are crazy. And I actually happen to know that there's one person in that meeting who they had COVID not that long ago, but they have not gotten the vaccine. And I didn't say anything, but I know that it was an awkward moment for them, because they, one person, myself, knew that. And those awkward moments are going to proliferate for people. And I think, that combined with like wanting to go to a football game, or wanting to get on whatever it ends up being, I think those are going to make a big difference.
Yeah, I think so too. I work in my day job at a university, and that's sort of an ongoing question for universities, for schools, is do we require it? And even if you don't, I think there is going to be that social pressure at some point for people to have been vaccinated, to get vaccinated. So I think that is coming. It is happening.
And I also think it's important to remember that not everybody who has not gotten the vaccine is like buying into conspiracy theories about the vaccine. I mean, some people are just like, yeah, I'm going to do it. But they feel like, oh, that's kind of left the news. Maybe that's less of an issue, And so sometimes it may just be like, yeah, you can still get this thing. It can still kill you. I mean, just, reminding people, bringing it, in front of mind.
Mm. Yeah, I just saw that Mike DeWine in Ohio is offering, they're going to start having like a lottery for people who've gotten the vaccine and they could win $1 million. So there's that
Not a
method
bad idea.
too.
Yeah, not a bad idea at all.
I was a little disappointed. I got my vaccine in Ohio, but since I'm not an Ohio resident, I'm not eligible for that $1 million. So alas.
Yeah, well, you gotta lobby your governor.
Lobby my governor or just move back to Ohio.
Yeah, either one.
You talk a lot about, how we have these relationships, how we can have these individual conversations, how we can get to be, maintain the relationships that we have with people. Do you think there's a way to extend that into politics more? So, if you were running for president, let's say, how do you extend that message that you can have one-on-one with people, that these conversations that you can have? How do we get to a point where we can have that in a larger space, or do we get to that point? Is it something that only works in this sort of one-to-one kind of relationship?
It's interesting. I don't actually think of the two as all that separate because because the most effective endorsement you can get is from somebody that a voter knows, right? Like you can get the very best interest group endorsement, or you can get the very best politician endorsement, but it's not as good as getting the endorsement of somebody's next door neighbor. And so to me, campaigns have to integrate this strategy. And, I think about ways that campaigns have done that. When you think about what Elizabeth Warren did in her campaign, with I'm going to take every selfie, because that's something that people are going to post. And yes, that's social media, but what it really is it's, if you post that, you're saying to everybody, this is my person, right? And that is, not that dissimilar from bringing it up in conversation, like, and it's going to be people who you don't know through politics. It's, it's just like people you went to grade school with, who you're still friends with on Facebook. Like, so that I think is how you integrate the two. And I also think it's not just about social, it is about old school word of mouth, because when you think about, and this goes back to like why we started Majority 54, the majority of Americans, weren't down with Trump and aren't down with, extremism, right-wing extremism. So what that means is, or extremism generally, and what that means is that if that majority of Americans were just bringing up politics in a polite and respectful, but, audacious way in their everyday life, it'd be more effective than any ad campaign, any digital campaign, anything you could ever do, because there are more of us than there are of them. And so if we are, blasting through that awkward moment at a family dinner or whatever it is, and just saying like, hey, have you heard about, this gun bill that's before Congress, to people who we haven't always discussed that kind of thing with, there's no more effective campaign that I could possibly imagine. So I think the two have to be integrated.
So I want to follow up on this guns comment. So, of course, you
Sure.
famously were the person who, in a commercial, were able to put together an AR-15 blindfolded and challenged Roy Blunt to do the same. And in fact, I mentioned to one or two people I know that I was interviewing you, and there are people who don't follow politics very closely. And they said, oh, who's that? And I said, the guy who put together the AR-15. And that's how they knew you. So
Yeah.
you can speak with some authority about guns in a way that someone like me can't. I've never even touched a gun. So how do we then have those conversations with, and they're people that we all know, that we all love, who are really worried that Democrats are going to come and take their guns. They are really worried that, they won't be safe anymore, or they won't be able to fend off government overreach if they don't have their guns. How do we have these conversations about having smart gun laws, having safe gun laws, and how can people like you, who can speak with that authority, further that conversation?
So a couple of things here. First, I think it's important for us to acknowledge something, which is we've won this argument. And I say that, and I think it's important to start there, because it often feels as if we haven't. And the reason it feels as if we haven't is because we haven't gotten anything passed through Congress yet. But that doesn't mean that we have failed to win the argument. We have to be really careful on issues like this, like voting rights, like climate change. All of these issues, we have to not confuse the fact that our system is fundamentally broken right now, and that we have, issues like gerrymandering and, all these issues that break the system and therefore impede progress, or at least make progress much, much harder to achieve. We can't allow that to discourage us and make us think that we're not making a difference in persuading people, because the vast majority of Americans want common sense gun reform. Now, that said, the only way we're going to get it is if we persuade even more people, right? Or if we change the law, change the rules in the Senate, which is a whole other conversation. But I think, you can go back to that ad I did. What sometimes people don't remember is that ad was basically me saying, yeah, I'm for gun control because I know what the heck I'm talking about. And that's important, but not for the reason that most people think. I think most people figure that's important because I know what I'm talking about. But when you think about the voters that are actually persuadable on the gun issue, who would be gettable otherwise, right? Voters who are like, they agree with us on most everything, but the gun issue is what pulls them away. It is rarely the case, in my experience, that those folks actually believe that Democrats are going to go take their hunting rifle, that Democrats are going to go take their pistol that they have in their home for home protection, their shotgun for the same purpose. It's usually not the case. That they may say that in a poll, but when you talk to them, that's not what's going on. What's really going on is that there's an undertone of the argument when people say they're going to take your guns. What they mean is, this person would not fit in with you and your friends. Culturally, they are not like you, and you don't have anything in common. So when, for instance, a liberal Democrat from Kansas City is running in Missouri, and they're saying that, what they're saying over and over again, really, to those gettable voters is, if he wound up on your block or hanging out in your local watering hole, he would stand out like a sore thumb. And so an ad like that, where I'm advocating for gun control, is me saying, this is what I'm about. We may not agree. You and I would get along fine, though. And I think that's really important on these, particularly on these cultural issues, is to remind people, I think Democrats often make the mistake of thinking that they have to take a conservative position in order to bridge that divide. You don't have to. In fact, people sniff that out and they don't respect it, right? So what you do is you say, here's what I'm about, here's why, and you just do it in a way that people from where you're from talk, right? Like, I'll give you an example that's not guns, but in 2016, right before the run up to that election in October, just a couple weeks out, President Obama issued guidance, or his Department of Education issued guidance on transgender on the transgender bathroom rules for public schools. And this happened a couple weeks before the election, and I'm running in Missouri. And I, rarely parted with Obama on anything. And most of the pundits were like, okay, this is the moment where Kander, he has no choice. 2 weeks at that moment, I was ahead, and it was really close. And this was before the Comey letter, obviously. And so they're like, okay, he's got a slight lead. There's no way that he's going to agree with Obama on transgender bathrooms. Well, I agreed with Obama on transgender bathrooms. I did it very publicly. I did it right away. I just said it the way somebody from Missouri says it. And all I said is, look, I have no interest in discriminating against other people's kids. Period. That was it. I agreed, and I just said it the way somebody would say it if they were, at a block party with their neighbors and the issue came up. And it didn't affect the race. And so it's just be yourself and sound like someone who's from where you're from and say what you believe.
That's such great advice. And, I think about this a lot because I'm from Stark County, Ohio. So I'm from one of these places where that's how people talk, but now I live in Chicago, and I feel like there is this cultural divide sometimes when I try to go back and speak the language of Stark County, Ohio. I'm not a different person than I was. They're not different people than they were, but it does feel sometimes like we have almost a separate, it's not actually a separate vocabulary, but it feels that way. It feels like there is this divide, and that it's hard to sound like you are from there, that you are that person when you have been in this other place. But really, we're not different. I think the kinds of things I'm thinking about, people in my life who own lots of guns and, talk about being worried about someone taking the guns from them, we have way more in common than we have that separates us. So I think that that's important to try to get back to that being able to talk the same language.
The key is empathy. And the thing is it's very hard to be empathetic if you don't spend time around folks, right? And so that's how we all end up in our bubbles. And we live in a day and age where it's the longest period in American history without some form of mandatory service. We have a gazillion different entertainment options, so there's no shared experience there. And really, unless you make an effort, it's very hard in most people's day-to-day life to be exposed to people who are, living a different life than you, or, disagree with you. The only exception to that tends to be when the circumstances are very unequal, when it is somebody who is in a service job. It's somebody where you are not in that engagement, like in that exchange, you're not on equal footing, and that's not good enough. That doesn't count, right? So it takes effort. And for me, I'm no longer, I don't do the paid CNN gig anymore. I did it for about a couple of years ago. But when I did it, I officed during that period out of the electricians union's hall near my house. And I just had a tiny little office with me and my assistant. And then we had a big staff around the country for Let America Vote. But like, I was working out of Kansas City, and I could have worked out of my house. I could have worked out of a co-working space, but I chose to work at the IBEW hall because what I wanted to do is, if I knew I was going to have a TV hit that night, or I was going to go give a speech, rather than watching cable news and saying the same thing as everybody else, I walked down to the break room at lunch and I ate in there and I listened to folks and I talked to folks. And so then when I went on TV that night, I sounded distinctly different. I took my positions that I believed in, but I had already road tested them against guys who, were doing work as electricians all day long. So I think the key is to continue to expose yourself to that, because it is a perishable skill.
You mentioned that this is a time period without national service. Do you think that some sort of national service, wouldn't have to be military, of course, but that could start to bridge these divides a little bit, that people could be exposed to something outside of what they grew up with?
I think it's imperative that we do it. And I think it should be mandatory. I don't think it should be mandatory military. But at the end of the day, all these things that we talk about with regard to polarization, everything from voter suppression to voting rights to the way gerrymandering is, to the way campaigns are financed, all of this, we are trying to fix a cultural problem with political solutions. And don't get me wrong, we have a huge political problem in this country with our democracy, and we should fix it with those political solutions. It's imperative that we do. But if we were to pass the For the People Act tomorrow, and it's a generational change, generational importance piece of legislation, and I'm working to make sure we do. But look, if we were to pass it tomorrow, I think in a couple of years, we would be shocked to find out that it hadn't changed as much in the country as far as the dialogue and that kind of thing as we want it to, because we have a cultural problem. And that cultural problem is Americans no longer know one another. What do Americans, politicians always say, what unites us is we're all Americans. That's true, but I don't know what that means anymore. I mean, it's like a 1 in 3 chance that you watch the Super Bowl and a 100% chance that you have a strong opinion one way or the other on Taylor Swift. Like, that's what unites Americans, and that's not enough. And so the reason we need mandatory service of some kind is not the more predictable thing that people say, that is, we need people to serve their country and get invested in the success of their country. Yes, that is a benefit of it. But we need to do it because we need to force Americans to know people who are nothing like them. Because you only have the level of division we have within a culture when you have not just a lack of knowing one another, but you have an animosity and a fear of people who are not like yourself. And the only way to bridge that is to force us to be around people who are not like ourselves. And by the way, also to create a shared experience. We don't have that anymore. And at some point you lose that. When I say national identity, I think sometimes people take that to mean like that is somehow the opposite of multiculturalism. It's not. Multiculturalism is our national identity, but we don't have every American invested in that. And the only way we're ever going to get there is if we know each other again.
I love it. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. I'm ready to sign them up for national service right now.
I mean, same here. Look, I'm biased on this, right? Because look at my background, right? Like I grew up in a family. I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City in a Jewish family that was pretty well off. Like we were not hurting. And then what did I do? Like I went to law school. I became a lawyer. The trajectory of my life is one that there's no reason that I should have at any point had the ability to empathize with people who are not like myself, to care about, or to even have any comfort level or understanding of people who are not like myself. But there's one variable, one intervening factor. After 9/11, I joined the United States Army and I deployed to Afghanistan. And I learned that there were people from all over the place who were completely different than me that I became family with, and I cared about them. And it brought me out of that comfort zone. And there's nothing like, particularly for me as an officer, you know, I had people from every possible background who I was responsible for their life. And they would come to me with issues like their finances, with issues like about what was going on inside their body, because I was the person they would come to, and they were my family. And so that's what changed for me. So I've seen it happen.
I've been, for a separate project I'm doing, I've been thinking about World War I, and I've been thinking not about the people who were serving in World War I, but back at the home front, and how there was this collective coming together of people who were, you know, in the case I'm looking at, they were knitting socks and things for soldiers, or they were, you know, growing victory gardens or whatever it is, but they were thinking a lot about the war that was happening while they were still back home. And I think that is something that clearly just doesn't happen anymore. So, you know, Biden announced that by September 11th of this year, the troops are going to withdraw from Afghanistan. And despite the fact that I've known that we were at war for 20 years and I know people who've served, I just don't think about it that much. It's just not a part of my life. So what does that mean for people who serve and who are at war when you come home, when you come back, and know that life has not changed that much for people who are back stateside? You know, what does that look like, and how can we have more empathy for people who are in the military, think more about that, focus more on that?
It's a great question. And the answer as to what it means for folks in the military is it's incredibly damaging. For anybody interested in this subject, there's a great book. It's maybe the best nonfiction book I've read in the last 10 years. And it's by Sebastian Junger. It's called Tribe: On Homecoming and Belonging. And one of the things that he looks at is over history, how different societies have handled the homecoming of warriors. And if you look at, for instance, a lot of Native American communities, they, you know, when there was a war, the warriors would come home, and they didn't just like, okay, you're back, let's just put you right back into life. They had a ceremony, they had purification rituals, they had return ceremonies. And in those, the warriors got up and they talked about the things they saw. Mm. And so what that did is it bridged that divide. Now, the rest of the community, they weren't there on the battlefield, but they were also not allowed to shield themselves from it. Which did a couple of things. One, and this is pretty important, it made it so that those warriors didn't feel like they were going through the aftermath of that by themselves, that they had to keep that stuff inside. The other thing it does is it educates the rest of the community about, you know, what war is like. It doesn't sanitize it for them, which makes it that much less likely that that a war will be undertaken lightly in the future. And, you know, that stuff's really important. I mean, my personal experience has been that I can remember, you know, I was back a few weeks maybe in 2007 when I was in a bar and somebody said to me, well, at least you weren't in Iraq. I mean, nothing's really happening in Afghanistan, right? And I couldn't, I was very angry at them, but I knew that was not fair to them. I couldn't help it because I knew that at that time, the narrative was Iraq is the war and nothing's happened in Afghanistan. Never mind that the per capita casualty rate was the same. You know, but that, and I remember how upsetting that was to me. And I also, as a public person who, you know, my experience in the military was a big part and is a big part of who I am. And so I talked about that a fair amount. I also knew what were the 3 or 4 stories I could tell that I could tell in a way that wouldn't upset me, but also, most importantly, wouldn't cause the audience or the person I was talking to recoil. And every combat veteran who's listening to this knows what I'm talking about, which is a few times, it doesn't take long before you put your hand on that live wire and learn quickly that people say they want to hear about your service, but they're not really prepared to. Because there's a point at which, there were a few times where people are like, no, tell me more. Tell me a story about this. And there were a few times where I was like, okay, I'll chance it. I'll try it. And you can just feel the person recoil, and you can feel it change their idea of you. And so the best thing is for us to have more opportunities for soldiers who come home to talk about what they went through. In the book, In Tribe, Sebastian Junger proposes this idea, which he's now trying to get off the ground, which are veteran town halls that are not like traditional town halls where people come and ask questions, but they are events where you show up and veterans get up and they talk, kind of like those Native American community rituals. They talk about their experience, and you demonstrate your patriotism and your commitment to veterans by showing up and listening. And that's the kind of thing. But on top of that, to the preface you started with, there has to be sacrifice by people other than the military. Because right now, the military goes to war and the country doesn't. And that is a perfect formula for having the longest war in the history of the country. And that's Afghanistan. And look, if you went back in time and you wrote the American story from the beginning, obviously there's a lot of stuff you'd change. But one thing that you would definitely not keep the same is you would not write Afghanistan as the longest war in American history. You just wouldn't. And the only way you get there is when the military is at war and the country's not. And you can take it all the way back to the moment after 9/11 when the country was ready to do whatever George W. Bush would ask. And he said, go shop. When what he should have said is, buy war bonds and don't cash them in, or whatever it is. Like, he should have, and then cut taxes. Like, no, war costs, and there should be a cost. Otherwise it goes on forever.
So you are now the president of the Veterans Community Project. Can you talk some about what that project is, what you're seeking to do? We can't go back and change the course of this war with Afghanistan, but we can certainly do more to help our veterans. And so give us some action items, some things we can do.
I really appreciate the softball free plug for VCP. I'll take it. Thank you very much. So Veterans Community Project is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Kansas City. It was founded by a group of local combat veterans, of which I'm not one of the co-founders. I've come along later. But what it does is a couple of things. One, it provides outreach walk-in services to any veteran who comes in with any need. So unlike the VA, and the VA has wonderful people. I go to the VA, but the VA system can be onerous. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know about the VA system is there are limits on who qualifies as a veteran, and there are limits on what amount of services that veterans can get depending on what kind of service they had. Well, at Veterans Community Project, our approach is if you raised your right hand and took the oath and then served for like an hour, fine, you qualify for 100% of our services. We don't have there's no grading of service. It's just you get everything. And it's just across the board, very low barrier. And so we help people through the outreach program with everything from their VA paperwork to emergency assistance funds if they're about to miss a rent payment or a car payment, to career counseling, to just anything you can think, veterinary care for their animals. Like, what VCP has done that's so brilliant is it has dipped into the very rich reservoir of goodwill that exists in society toward veterans and said, whatever you do, you can do it here. You don't have to just stand up at a ball game and applaud when a veteran's in the Jumbotron. You can actually do things. So we do that through the Outreach Center, but we also do it through the Community Center, which is what we're better known for, which is a part of our program to fight veterans' homelessness. And in that, we build villages of tiny houses with wraparound case management services for homeless veterans, and we transition them back into permanent housing. I came into it 2 years ago because I actually went into the Outreach Center to get help with my VA paperwork. And then 6 months later, after going through weekly therapy for PTSD at the VA, I came on board and became the president of Veterans Community Project. And we are expanding nationally. We're building these campuses around the country now. And I should add, we are privately funded, and we're based on donations, and people can go to veteranscommunityproject.org to help.
Excellent. We will put a link up so that people will, in fact, go donate. I love the pictures of the tiny houses too. It's just it's such an incredible idea. And you're right. When I go to a baseball game or something, and they say stand up and applaud, and it feels so shallow. It feels like there's got to be something more that we can do. And so having something more to do is fantastic. You just mentioned your therapy for PTSD. Of course, you very publicly talked about depression and PTSD when you stepped down from the mayoral race for Kansas City. How are you doing now? And can you just say a little bit about what that mental health journey looked like for you?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'm doing better than. I'm doing great. I'm doing better than I have since before I deployed. And so I'm so glad that I decided to get better. I went about 11 years after my deployment, sort of fighting myself and refusing to admit to myself that I had post-traumatic stress. So I spent over a decade with untreated, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress, which meant, for me, the symptoms were violent nightmares, hypervigilance, which is to say, sort of feeling like you're in danger or your family's in danger all the time, self-loathing and shame and emotional numbness and that sort of thing. And then that after 11 years of not getting a good night's sleep and going through those symptoms, then there are other symptoms that develop out of that. So for me, that was depression, and eventually what developed out of that was suicidal ideation, and which is to say suicidal thoughts. And that was the point at which first what happened was I was getting ready to run for president, and I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to say it was PTS yet. So I was like, well, I know what'll fix this hole inside me. I'll go home and I'll become the mayor and I'll serve my neighbors. And we were going to win the mayor's race pretty handily, which, obviously when you're going to run for president and you choose to run for mayor, you should be in a position to win your local mayor's race pretty handily. So that was all going well, but it wasn't going well for me. And that's when things spiraled out of control and I decided to get help. And I, publicly said that that's what I was doing. So I went through two kinds of therapy for PTSD. I went to the VA. And so I went through what's called cognitive processing therapy, which is, talk therapy, but really what it was for me was like an education, like a course in my brain and in how post-traumatic stress works, and sort of helping me understand how the behaviors that I had gotten used to, the coping mechanisms and all that, where that came from. Because if you understand, like G.I. Joe said, knowing is half the battle, right? So that was big for me and important, but equally important was something called prolonged exposure therapy, which was a combination of talking about my traumatic experiences until they no longer had a grip on me so much, and also doing things like in everyday life that forced me to stop using safety behaviors. So it would be everything from like prolonged exposure therapy could be listening to a recording of myself every day in between weekly sessions talking about a traumatic experience in Afghanistan, but it could also be, probably in the same day, going to a restaurant and sitting with my back to the door for 45 minutes without turning around, right? And making myself do that. And over time, like any injury, it got better and better and better. It doesn't get cured because it's based on memories, but it gets better, and it gets to the point where the symptoms no longer disrupt your life. And that's where I am now. I compare it to, right before I went into the Army, I blew out my knee. I was playing pickup football and trying to be a hero, and I ruptured my ACL in my knee, and I had to get surgery and go through physical therapy to get into the Army. So I have knee problems, but I'm in pretty good shape, and I can go out and I can run. But I know that there's a point at which it's going to hurt. So I'm going to have to take some Advil, and I'm going to have to ice it really well afterwards. I'm going to have to stretch, but I can still run and I can still hang in there. And you can get to a point, if you put in the work and you do the therapy, where that's what post-traumatic stress can be in your life. That's what it is for me. I still have post-traumatic stress, but now I know it when I see it. And when I have a symptom of some kind, I'm pretty good about not just hating myself for it and finding myself to be dysfunctional. I go, oh, I know what that is, and I know how to manage it, and it doesn't disrupt my life in the same way.
Therapy is wonderful. Everyone should go.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I have not had a particularly traumatic moment, but suffered extreme anxiety for a few years, and I could not do what I do, could not be talking to you right now if I had not gone to therapy. It's and putting in the work, though, I think is the other piece of what you said that is so important about that.
That's the part that was the biggest surprise to me about it. Is I think I sort of pictured therapy like antibiotics or something. Like you go and like you sit there and you talk, and it's almost like getting an IV drip or something. But it's much more like physical therapy or like grad school. I mean, you go to your appointments and you do the work there, but you got to do the work in between. You got to do the homework, and you got to be really committed to it. And if you do that, it makes a huge difference, and it's totally worth it.
Well, Jason, I think I could probably keep asking you questions all night, but we both have kids and other stuff, so I should let you go. But remind everyone how to listen to your podcast and how to follow you on Twitter.
Awesome. First of all, I enjoyed this. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, my podcast is Majority 54. You can get it wherever you get your podcast, wherever you get this podcast, you can get it. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Jason Kander. Kander is Kander. And same thing on Instagram, at Jason Kander. So thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.